Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our class, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. We've been discussing sacrifice in chapters 3 and 4 of the Gita, so we'll be continuing to discuss the concept of yajna, sacrifice, in the Gita today, and we're going to try to cover verses 28 through 35 of chapter 4 of the Gita. We won't finish discussing them. There's a long handout that I made for this class, which we'll start to look at today, assuming we have time. And then we'll continue discussing especially verses 33 to 35 next Sunday at the same time, 9:30 a.m. here. There's no additional homework because there's a lot to discuss about these verses, because I think that he's making connections with other verses implicitly. So we need to understand some of the verses in later chapters as well. Brigitte, can you take a handout? Thanks. Okay, so next class, Sunday, August 18th. And for a bonus, I'm giving the Sunday talk next week after the class called The Radiant Light Within. It's a little plug. So come to that too. Okay, 2 for the price of 1. And bring your handout. The handout that you're taking today, bring it next week. It's very important. I don't want to have to print out another 15 copies. Okay. All right. In chapter 3, we were in a couple classes ago, we were discussing, take a handout please, we were discussing yajna, and those verses seem to be very kind of like very concrete and referring to specifically Vedic rituals involving actual material sacrifices for what? For worldly benefits and for enjoying life in heaven and then coming back, and it seemed a little bit crude, a little bit of what Swamiji calls sanctified shopkeeping. And Sri Aurobindo suggested that there's a more symbolic and spiritual way of interpreting sacrifice, yajna, and even those verses. So that's what we already discussed. And one of his main arguments for that is, can you turn down the temperature a little bit? It's a little stuffy in here. One of his arguments is that chapter 4, the concept of yajna is clearly much broader and more spiritual. And we've already started to see how that's the case. We discussed last time Brahmarpanam Brahmahavid Brahmagno Brahmanahutam Brahmevatena Gantavya Brahmakarma Samadhina. Everything, every element in the traditional Vedic sacrifice, the sacrificer, the fire into which you sacrifice, the object being sacrificed, everything is Brahman, right? And then we started to see, especially looking at verses 26 to 27, that even there are different methods of self-control in spiritual practice. Each of those can be considered a type of sacrifice in a metaphorical and spiritual sense. Okay, we discussed that last time. So now we're going to start with verse 28. So please open your apps and go to verse 28. And before I do that, Gopal asked a good question. What exactly is sacrifice? What is yajna? What is sacrifice? I think we can do no better than to read what Swamiji says, Swami Vedanta. So let me read that first. Swamiji, in the context of, he's addressing the first batch of sannyasis in Bilurman in the history of the Ramakrishna order. So it's a very momentous occasion. And he gave a lecture called Sannyasa, Its Ideal and Practice. And he said, I've read this before, but I want to read it again. It's very important to keep this in mind. Let all our actions, and see, it doesn't just apply to sannyasis, it applies to all spiritual aspirants. Okay? Let all our actions, eating, drinking, and everything that we do, tend towards the sacrifice of ourself. You nourish your body by eating. What good is there in doing that if you do not hold it as a sacrifice to the well-being of others? You nourish your minds by reading books, like we're doing here right now. There's no good in doing that unless you hold it also as a sacrifice to the whole world. For the whole world is one. You are rated a very insignificant part of it, and therefore it is right for you that you should serve your millions of brothers rather than aggrandize this little self. Thus you must die a gradual death. In such a death is heaven. All good is stored therein, and in its opposite is all that is diabolical and evil. So what is yajna most fundamentally? Sacrifice of ego, sacrifice of the lower self, of selfishness, that rascal I, bodjatami, Sri Ramakrishna would say. The rascal I that's attached to worldly things and to self-aggrandizement. Sacrifice that for the sake of the higher self and for God. That's the fundamental concept of sacrifice. So now, with that in the background, let's look at verse 28 of chapter 4. Dravya yajnas. Okay, with more feeling and punch. Dravya yajnas. Tapo yajna. Yoga yajnas. Tatha pare. Swadhyaya. Jnana yajnascha. Yatayaha. Samshitavrataha. Okay, so Krishna here continues to give a very broad spiritual / symbolic interpretation of the concept of sacrifice, yajna, and explaining all the different things that count as forms of sacrifice. Like what? Dravya yajna, material yajna, the sacrifice of anything material, especially in, like with these traditional Vedic sacrifices. You can literally sacrifice a horse, cast it in the fire, fall chanting certain mantras with the priest there and everything. But it could also be the sacrifice of wealth. If you make a lot of money and you give some portion of your money to serve the poor, the needy, it's a kind of dravya yajna, right? Okay, so dravya yajna, tapo yajna. Now it gets even more kind of symbolic and spiritual. Tapaha means austerity. Any kind of austerity you practice itself is a kind of sacrifice. What's meant by austerity? Gita, much later in the text, chapter 17, I believe, explains different kinds of austerity. I'm not going to go into it now. But there are many forms of austerity, the common denominator being anything that militates against or that works against the lower I, selfishness, ego, is a kind of austerity. Okay? And so restraint of speech even counts as austerity because you're inclined to say something to hurt another person or, to aggrandize yourself. Restraining that impulse itself is a kind of austerity. That's what's called vangmayam tapaha in Bhagavad Gita. But there are many other kinds of austerities. Well, I gave a whole talk called Spiritualizing Physical Fitness, where I claim that one of the ways in which physical fitness is itself a spiritual practice, if you do it with the right attitude, is that all physical exercise is a form of austerity. Literally, because what's happening is you're taxing your body. It's not fun, especially people who are pain averse, who don't like, taxing their bodies. Why? Pain aversion comes from identification with the body. So once you get used to that exercise, what happens? You get used to this pain aversion. Why? Because you're gradually diminishing your identification with the body mind complex. And so if you do it consciously while you're doing exercise, especially the more strenuous the better, and you repeat a mantra, for instance, remind yourself that you're the Atman separate from the body-mind complex, that becomes a very powerful spiritual practice. I read an article a long time ago about these ultra-marathoning Buddhist monks. Ultra-marathon means over the 26.2 mile standard marathon. And they were asked, what's your secret? And they said, we repeat a mantra constantly throughout the entire marathon, ultra-marathon. What's the idea? The mantra helps to take you out of your body. And they literally talk about, the runner's high they talk. It's a kind of literally an outer body experience. Even though they're putting their body through tremendous struggle and suffering in a certain sense, right? You're taxing the body to its utmost, to its limit. But you get this, you elevate your consciousness to a state where you don't even feel it. You don't even feel the body, right? Okay, sorry. So that's all about tapo yajna. How tapas itself, any form of austerity can itself be a form of sacrifice. And austerity needs to be interpreted very, very broadly. Take a handout, Sulan. Oh. Yeah. Okay. What are other forms of austerity? Tatha apare yoga yajna. Yoga can also be a form of yajna, sacrifice. What does yoga mean? Lord knows, because the thing is, the word yoga in the Gita has many different meanings in different contexts. I would be inclined to take it in a very broad sense to mean any kind of spiritual practice. The way that Swamiji interprets it, the 4 yogas, but there are many other yogas as well. Sri Aurobindo here suggests something a little bit more narrow. He says, like the pranayama of the Raja Yogins and Hatha Yogins, or any other yoga yagya. But then he admits that there is a broader way of interpreting it. So anyway, the term yoga, as I said, can mean, I would say yoga means spiritual practice. So any kind of spiritual practice is also a form of yajna. Why? Because you're sacrificing the lower self, the selfish I, for the sake of realizing a higher spiritual reality, your own higher self or God. What else? Samshitavrataha yatayaha. Okay, so those are the sacrifices which are engaged in by whom? Yatayaha. Yogis, who exercise self-control, and who are samshitavrataha, who have purified themselves through making strict vows, like resolving to do certain things to make spiritual progress and not to do other things, right? So that's also part of it. They're kind of both. Vows involve both things, doing things that are positive and also avoiding things that are negative. Oh, and then there's finally another kind of yajna mentioned, swadhyaya jnana yajna. There's a sacrifice in the form of the study of scriptures, which is a form of jnana yajna, knowledge sacrifice. But this would be knowledge sacrifice with a lowercase k, let's say, which is different from when we eventually get to verse 4.33, verse 33. There, I would say it's the knowledge sacrifice with a capital K, because that's a full-blown spiritual knowledge. Here, it's talking about the study of scriptures, what we're doing literally right now. This is a form of sacrifice. Us sitting here today, this is sacrifice. Because we're studying the scriptures in order to transcend or eliminate our selfishness in the lower I and to achieve a higher spiritual state, right, of blessedness. Okay, so now let's go to the next verse. Krishna is going to detail other forms of sacrifice in more detail. So, please repeat after me. Apane juhvati pranam prane panam tatha pare pranapanagati rudva pranayama parayanaha. Pranayama itself is a kind of sacrifice. What is pranayama? Most of you know it. The control of the breath, right? So the ingoing breath, the incoming breath, and then there's what's called kumbhaka, which is retention of breath, and then there's the exhalation. But there's a very beautiful metaphor used here. Pranayama itself is a form of sacrifice because you're sacrificing the what's the exact word here for the in-breath? The incoming breath into the outgoing breath, and vice versa as well. So even that pranayama process itself can be seen as a form of sacrifice. Okay. With regard to pranayama, it's kind of popular these days, and I think part of the reason is because there seem to be it's a very tangible practice, and people feel really good really quickly by doing the practice, but there are also dangers. Swamiji talks about the dangers in Raja Yoga. He says you have to be very careful. If you're really serious about practicing pranayama for extended periods, you have to practice strict celibacy, because if you don't, you might go crazy. He uses very strong language. Okay. And so we should be careful. And ideally you'd be doing pranayama under the guidance of a guru, a qualified guru. And Sri Ramakrishna also adds all the benefits of pranayama, and this, especially what happens if you do pranayama for a long time is that you naturally attain the state of kumbhaka, where the breath thins out to the point where you don't even need to breathe in or out for a long period of time. And what Sri Ramakrishna says is you can achieve that through bhakti. You don't actually have to go through these rigorous pranayama practices to achieve that state. By just thinking of God constantly, you automatically attain the state of natural kumbhaka, this retention of breath. It's another thing to keep in mind. So I don't want all of you to just run off and start doing pranayama all day. That's all. Okay. Verse 30. Apare niyataharaha pranan Praneshu juhvati. Sarvepyete yajna vido yajna shapita kalmashaha. Okay. Yet other people, apare, what do? Pranayama parayana, huh? I see. He's actually combining these two verses. Or whoever's doing the anvaya here. So I'm going to skip two. Okay. Apare, others, niyata aharaha. People who control their food habits, what they put into their mouth, food and drink. That itself can be a form of sacrifice. Most of us are familiar with this, all sorts of diets and things like that. But the aim, it's all about attitude. If you do it in order to look good and beautiful and blah, blah, not as spiritual as the attitude of wanting to keep the body healthy because it's a temple of the divine, because you need to be healthy in order to engage in spiritual practices. That's the right attitude, right? So everything depends on attitude. Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to mention in the context of verse 28. But we can talk about it now. Sacrifices, anything can be a sacrifice if you have an attitude, a spirit of sacrifice in whatever you're doing. Regardless of what it is, whatever the activity is. The Gita is just giving you a few examples, but literally any action can be a sacrifice if you do it with the attitude of sacrifice. What's the opposite of a spirit of sacrifice? Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's actually fairly simple. So you have to ask yourself when you're doing something, am I really doing this in an attitude of sacrifice, in a spirit of sacrifice? And if there's some selfishness in the attitude, then try to remove it. And it's not always all or nothing. It could be half sacrifice and half ego and selfishness, and so try to remove the ego from it, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's eating or studying or whatever it is. Spiritual practice. Spiritual practice itself, there's a great danger that even in people think that if I'm sitting in the room and meditating or even serving the poor and this kind of stuff, that's automatically unselfish. That's also not true. Because you can engage in charity and other things with the spirit of egoism. And Gita itself talks about it later, where it says that there's rajasika giving. Rajasika charity is what? I'm giving, let's say even like $1 billion. But there's ego behind it. I want name and fame, I want recognition, I want my name emblazoned on all the newspapers and on TV. You're shooting yourself in the foot. That's not the most that's not sacrifice fully. Right? Okay, so always keep that in mind. Okay, so then, summing up, the second line of verse 30 says, Sarve apiyete, all of these different people who engage in sacrifices, all the different forms. The sacrifice of study of scriptures, the sacrifice of pranayama, the sacrifice of self-control, all of them are knowers of sacrifice, yajna vidaha. They know the true meaning of sacrifice. Yajna kshapita kalmashaha, and they purify themselves of all their sins and selfish tendencies by means of these sacrifices. That's the point. So all spiritual practice is a sacrifice if you do it in the right spirit, which means with an unselfish spirit. Okay? So now let's look at verse 31. Please repeat after me. Yajñashishtamrita bhujo. Okay, let's try it again. Yajñashishta amrita bhujo yanti brahma sanatanam nayam lokaha asti ayajñasya. Notice ayajñasya, the person who does not engage in sacrifice. Kutonyaha guru sattama. Alright. Hey Guru Sattama, O Arjuna, Yajna Shishta Amrita Bhujaha, those people who enjoy the nectar of what remains from a sacrifice, from the sacrifice, Yajna Shishta. Sanatanam Brahma Yanti, they attain the eternal Brahman. Ayajnaha, Ayajñasya, but however, by contrast, the person who does not engage in sacrifice, when he or she does things, does not have the attitude of sacrifice. What happens? Ayam lokaha na asti. They don't achieve happiness and success and fulfillment in this life. Ayam lokaha, in this world. Anyaha kutaha, not to speak of the next world. This is also important. This last line I think is really important. I talked about this briefly in the context of a previous verse in the last class, I think, but I want to mention it here. Some people think that spiritual life is you're sacrificing happiness in this life for the sake of greater happiness in future lives and ultimately in some kind of eternal heaven in the future, something like that. But the truth is, if we lead a selfish life, a kind of hedonistic life based on maximizing our own pleasure, we won't even be happy in this life. That's why I mentioned in the previous class Martin Seligman's book. Have you run out of copies? Okay, we're good. Okay. Authentic Happiness, where he says there's one way of living life which is based on the pleasant life, maximizing our own happiness. And he says that is a recipe for unhappiness. So I think that's also what the Gita is saying here. It's not just that you lose out in the other world, right, after we leave the body, but we're not going to achieve fulfillment in this life either. All right, let's look at 32. Please repeat after me. Oh, sorry, the other thing I wanted to mention about verse 31. What exactly is meant by enjoying the nectar of immortality left over from the sacrifice? It's simple in the context of material sacrifices. We know when we do puja, in Hinduism we have a puja. Every day we have a noon puja where we offer what's made for lunch to Sri Ramakrishna. We sanctify the food, we offer to Sri Ramakrishna. Then what happens? When after Sri Ramakrishna partakes of it, that food becomes sanctified. It becomes what's called prasada. And then when we eat it, we add it to all the food. And then when we have lunch, we become sanctified by taking that food as prasada. Because it's sanctified. And how are we benefited? Our minds are purified, we develop devotion for God. Right? How in the world does that apply to the more spiritual the more symbolic forms of sacrifice? It makes sense in the context of when you're actually offering material things, like food. Tapasanji sees this as a real mystery. And I'm not going to read his footnote, but he kind of says that this is genuinely cryptic. How do we apply this concept of prasada, which makes sense in the context of offering food to God? How do we apply it to pranayama, for instance? How do we apply it to the sacrifice of austerity, for instance? I don't think it's as big of a problem as he seems to think it is. Maybe I'm just missing something, but it's a metaphor. And so whatever it is, let's say it's Swadhyaya, like we're doing now. This class, we're doing Swadhyaya Jnana Yagya, a knowledge sacrifice in the form of study of scriptures. What happens? Metaphorically, what's produced when we engage in this class with the right attitude? What's the wrong attitude? Doing this class in order to be able to show off to other people that you're very learned in the scriptures, and because then that becomes a source of ego, right? But if you're doing it in order to develop devotion, to purify the mind, to better understand and engage in spiritual practices, then that's the right attitude. That's the attitude of sacrifice. What happens? This class will generate a certain prasada, which if we partake of it, we benefit from it. So that's my take on it. Tapasanji seems to think it's like that there's something very mysterious about it. But I think if we take it as a metaphor, it can apply to all sacrifices. Every sacrifice generates a metaphorical prasada, which benefits us spiritually. All right, so now let's look at 32. Evam bahuvidha yagya vitata brahmano mukhe karmajan vidhitan sarvan evam jnatva vimokshyase. Okay. This verse is actually a little bit open to interpretation. Different commentators have interpreted the word Brahman in this verse in different ways, so we'll talk about that in a second. Let me first give the simple meaning. Evam bahuvidaha yagyaha. So, therefore, all these various kinds, bahuvidaha yagyaha, of sacrifice, brahmanaha mukhe vitataha, are spread out or extended at the what? At the mouth of Brahman. What does that mean? That's the question which commentators puzzle over. All of these different sacrifices are spread out at the mouth of Brahman. Tan sarvan karmajan vidhi, and know that all of these sacrifices are born of karma. Okay? Evam gyatva vimokshase. Knowing all this, what happens? You attain spiritual liberation, the highest spiritual fulfillment. Okay, so what's the interpretive issue? Well, what exactly does it mean for all of these different kinds of sacrifice to be spread out at the mouth of Brahman? Shankara says we can't take Brahman literally because it just doesn't make sense. So how should we take Brahman? Brahman means the Vedas, the scriptures, the Vedic scriptures. Tapasanji, who doesn't always follow Shankara, usually he doesn't, he thinks that Shankara is right here too. And so Tapasanji also takes Brahman here to mean the Vedas. And so Shankara and Tapasanji will both say, what? That these sacrifices are spread out at the mouth of the Vedas in the sense that one of the predominant themes of the Karma Kanda, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, is sacrifice. And even if you want to interpret it more broadly, the Vedanta aspect, the knowledge portion of the Vedas, also concerns sacrifice in a higher spiritual sense. So because the Vedas talk about sacrifice in different ways, this is just a fancy symbolic way of saying that all the different kinds of sacrifice are prominently featured in the Vedic scriptures. That seems to be Shankara's and Tapasanji's interpretation. By contrast, Sri Aurobindo says that it's more plausible to take the word Brahman literally. Brahman literally means Brahman, the divine. So then how do we interpret this phrase that all these different sacrifices are spread out at the mouth of Brahman? He gives a very beautiful symbolic interpretation. The mouth of the divine, he's saying the mouth of that fire with a capital F, which receives all offerings. So I think he's thinking back to Brahmarpanam Brahmahavi, verse 4.24, because Brahmagno Brahmanahutam. We sacrifice to the Brahman fire, Brahmagni. So using that metaphor, so remember, one of the specialities of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Gita, one of the things that makes his interpretation so sophisticated is that he gives contextual interpretations of terms in different verses. And so I think here he's saying that the best way to interpret Brahmano Mukhe, the mouth of Brahman, is to think of it in the context of 4.24, where the concept of Brahma Agni is introduced. This Brahman fire is introduced. So the mouth of that fire, because that's actually a typical Vedic metaphor. You can talk about the mouth of Agni, because you're offering things into it, right? And fire is like kind of swallowing, accepting those offerings in that sense. So all of these sacrifices are sacrifices to the divine. That's Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. And it links up with many other verses, I think, really nicely and consistently in the Gita. For instance, one of the famous shlokas in chapter 9, Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasiyat yat tapasisi kaunteya tat kurushva madarpanam. Whatever you do, whatever austerities you perform, whatever you eat, do them as an offering to me, says Krishna, an offering to the divine. So it links up with that very nicely. I think this is just a different way in the context of sacrifice of putting the same thing. Whatever you do it as a sacrifice, exactly like Swamiji is saying. All action should be done in a spirit of sacrifice. Okay, and then karmajan viditan sarvan. Know that all these sacrifices are karmajan. They are born of karma. What does that mean? There's a kind of obvious literal sense in which you're doing something. Even if it's pranayama and you're controlling your breath, or you're offering something material like in a puja, where you have a bhoga and you're offering food to God. That's one understanding. But Sri Aurobindo gives it a much vaster kind of spiritual interpretation. He says, all of these sacrifices proceed from and are ordained by the one vast energy of the divine, which manifests itself in the universal karma and makes all the cosmic activity a progressive offering to the one self and Lord, and of which the last stage for the human being is self-knowledge and the possession of the divine or Brahmic consciousness. The divine itself has both static and dynamic aspects. And the dynamic aspect of the divine is what Sri Ramakrishna calls Shakti. And this whole world is the play of Shakti. This is Shakti's Leela. This is the play of the divine. So all these sacrifices, in a sense, are different manifestations of, they are born of the eternal play of Shakti. in that sense. That's how I take Sri Aurobindo's reading of this. Okay? All right, so now we get to the verses 33 to 35, on which we will spend the remainder of this class and the entire next class, which is next Sunday, August 18th, at the same time. Be here, be square, 9:30 a.m. And please bring this handout that you have today next week, so I don't have to print it out for you guys again. Please. Okay, but before we look at the handout, let's read the verses. And I'll read all three together, and then we'll go through them slowly. Shreyan Dravyamayad Yajnaj Jnana Yajnaha Parantapa Sarvam Karmakilam Partha Jnane Parisamapyate. He Parantapa, O Arjuna, Dravya Mayat Yajnat Jnana Yajnaha Shreyan. Among all these sacrifices, material sacrifice is inferior to Jnana Yajna, the sacrifice of knowledge. And last time we talked about, both Anthony and Himajaya had this question about what exactly is meant by the sacrifice of knowledge. Why would we sacrifice knowledge? That sounds counterproductive. No, that's the problem with English. There's an ambiguity in that word of there. What is meant is knowledge sacrifice, aka sacrifice in the form of knowledge. Knowledge itself is the sacrifice. You're not giving up knowledge. Knowledge itself is understood as a sacrifice in a metaphorical sense. Because having that knowledge is the best and highest way to overcome all selfishness and egoism and realize the higher self, right? That's the idea. And God. Okay, so this knowledge sacrifice is superior to all material sacrifices. Why? Well, because material sacrifices, it depends on the spirit in which you do it. One way in which you do it is this lower form, which is encouraged by the Karma Kanda of the Vedas. I will sacrifice this horse following exactly what the priest tells me and what the Vedas tell me, chanting these particular mantras. For what? To attain happiness here and hereafter. So there's a kind of sanctified shopkeeping going on. But there's a higher spirit in which we can do it. When we do puja here, we don't do it for material benefits. We offer food to the Lord, to Sri Ramakrishna, asking for what? Nothing but bhakti, devotion, knowledge, detachment, spiritual qualities, compassion, selflessness, and so on and so forth. Right? Even then, superior to all those kinds of sacrifice, which are spiritual practices, is the actual highest spiritual knowledge, jnana yajna. So it's the difference between means and end. Spiritual practices are the means to the highest end of what? Liberative knowledge. Of what? Now here we get to the key question. Knowledge of what? This highest spiritual knowledge. What's the object of that knowledge? And what Sri Aurobindo says is, it has two key aspects. This jnana yajna. And that's why I gave a little mathematical formula here. Jnana yajna, knowledge sacrifice, equals what? Sri Ramakrishna's jnana and Sri Ramakrishna's vijnana. And this is why the rationale for the entire handout.
Swami,
yes.
What about the jnana yajna that was talked about in just the previous
Yeah, as I said, so the difference is between lowercase k and capital K.
But how do we know that it's not?
Well, that's a matter of interpretation. but the beauty of it is, helpfully, Krishna himself glosses us and tells us, hey, what I mean by jnana yajna in verse 28 is not the higher knowledge, because it's swadhyaya. He used the term swadhyaya there.
Yeah.
And it's a samasa, it's a compound word.
Yeah.
So he's saying jnana yajna, lowercase k, knowledge sacrifice, in the form of swadhyaya. Specifically in the form of study of scriptures. Whereas here, because of the context, where it says sarvam karmakilam partha jnane parisamapyate, which means all actions, all sacrifices culminate in this jnana yajna. It can't just have that ordinary meaning of study of scripture. It has to be this capital K knowledge sacrifice, the highest spiritual knowledge. Okay? But now, it's a good question. So now, what exactly does this knowledge, this highest spiritual knowledge consist in which all sacrifices culminate? And this gets to the heart of the entire class. Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna this handout, the title is Sri Aurobindo's contextual justification of his Ramakrishnan interpretation of the terms jnana and vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita. See, Bhagavad Gita at several places, chapter 3 for the first time, but also in chapter 7, also in chapter 9, refers to two terms in the same breath, jnana and vijnana, in the same verse. Okay? And commentators have had a lot of difficulty trying to figure out exactly what the difference is between jnana and vijnana. And one of the standard ways of interpreting the difference between jnana and vijnana, whenever these two terms are used in the Gita, is Shankara's, which is jnana is mere intellectual knowledge of the Atman. Vijnana is spiritual knowledge of the Atman. So difference between intellectual understanding and spiritual realization. But Swami Tapasanandaji, in his book, and Sri Aurobindo, in Essays on the Gita, they offer a very different interpretation, and they both interpret the terms jnana and vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita through the lens of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on jnana and vijnana. And you might say, that's great, we're all devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, and so, you're preaching the choir. But maybe we're biased because we love Sri Ramakrishna, and maybe this is just as eisegetic. What is that fancy term that we used to talk about in previous classes? Maybe this is another form of eisegesis. What does eisegesis mean? Anyone who remembers?
Our perspective.
Very good.
Our
Yeah.
perspective.
We are reading our own views and prejudices and biases into the text.
Yes.
I love Sri Ramakrishna. I love Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on jnana and vijnana. Therefore, when I see Krishna talking about jnana and vijnana, it must mean what Sri Ramakrishna means. That would not be a very rigorous interpretation of the terms. And I think this is the deeper reason why. You might wonder, if Sri Aurobindo was so influenced by Sri Ramakrishna, why doesn't he give him credit? This book, over 600 pages, he doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna once. Why? What is he, a plagiarist? Stealing Thakur's ideas and not giving him credit? No. The idea is, the more you mention Sri Ramakrishna, the more you open yourself to the charge of bias and eisegesis. Oh, this guy's a Ramakrishnite. And so naturally he's just going to willy-nilly interpret every verse of the Gita through the lens of Sri Ramakrishna. That's not very rigorous. So what does Sri Aurobindo do instead? Doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna once. But his interpretation of every verse is suffused with the spirit of Sri Ramakrishna, which is a much deeper way of interpreting the Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Deeper than what? Deeper than, see, there are other books, and I don't want to knock on other books, but I will a little bit. But there's a book by Swami Bhavanandaji, which many people appreciate, and I'm not saying it's bad. And one virtue of it is that he explicitly refers to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings to explain different verses in the Gita. So he's, right? In my opinion, Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita, even though there's not a single mention of Sri Ramakrishna, is actually much more Ramakrishnan in spirit, and a much deeper interpretation and understanding of the spiritual teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. That's what I mean. Okay, but you can all decide for yourselves. And that's the reason why I chose Essays on the Gita as our main textbook. Okay, so now, what does Sri Aurobindo do to justify his Ramakrishnan interpretation of the terms jnana and vijnana in the Gita? He provides a contextual justification. What do I mean by that? He says, look, the Gita has 700 verses. So to understand the meaning of a particular term in a particular verse, you have to see how that term is used in other verses in the Gita, and not just how that same term is used in other verses, but you have to make sure that the way you interpret those terms in that particular verse is consistent with the spirit of the Gita's teachings everywhere else. There has to be a coherence, an internal coherence and consistency across verses. And so the rationale behind this 3.5-page handout is the following. In verse 33, so now I'm giving a kind of high altitude explanation of these three verses, 33, 34, and 35 of chapter 4, and then we're going to go into the details. Verse 33 uses the word jnana multiple times. Jnana yagya, right? The knowledge sacrifice, and sarvam karmakilam partha jnane parisamapide. All actions, all sacrifices culminate in what? Jnana. The word vijnana is not used in 33 or 34 or 35. That's important to keep in mind. Another thing that gets a little tricky from an interpretive standpoint when the word jnana is paired with the word vijnana in the Gita, like in chapter 7 it'll come up, in chapter 9 it'll come up, then Sri Aurobindo will interpret jnana to mean what? What Sri Ramakrishna means, which is, I'll say very briefly, summarily here, knowledge of the non-dual self, or Brahman. Impersonal, attributeless, non-dual self, pure consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo will interpret vijnana, when it's paired with jnana in the Gita, chapter 7, chapter 9, and chapter 3, as what Sri Ramakrishna calls vijnana, which is a more expansive knowledge of the impersonal, personal Purushottama. Sri Ramakrishna will say, after jnana comes vijnana, and not everybody can attain that further state of vijnana, but if they do, if you're lucky enough, what do you realize? Jini nirgun tini shogun. That reality, which is nirguna, non-dual self, is also Shakti, Saguna Brahman, the personal God. And is both with form and without form. Okay? So when the two terms are paired, Sri Aurobindo will interpret jnana as knowledge of the non-dual self, which is impersonal and attributeless, and vijnana as this more expansive knowledge of the impersonal, personal Purushottama. But when the term jnana is used in isolation, like it is here, in 33 for instance, and 34, it's going to come up in 34 also, what Sri Aurobindo does, so I don't want you to get confused, it's not that he interprets the term jnana in all 700 verses, wherever it occurs in the verses, in the same way as knowledge of the non-dual self. Because that also would lack nuance and subtlety, because you have to look at the context of the verse. So in these verses, in verse 33 and in verse 34, when the term jnana is used, Sri Aurobindo means, how he interprets the term jnana is encompassing both Sri Ramakrishna's jnana and vijnana. It's really important to keep this in mind. I don't want you to get confused. Don't just equate jnana everywhere in the Gita with the knowledge of non-dual self. This encompasses both. Okay? It just means the highest spiritual knowledge, which is a combination of what Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana and vijnana. That's how he interprets jnana in both verse 33 and verse 34 of chapter 4. Okay? Now, how does this contextual justification work? What do I mean by it? Okay, should we shut the door? Okay. Because there's a highway, so it just creates a lot of noise. The first thing he does is, you cannot understand the highest spiritual knowledge, the meaning of jnana, in verses 33 and 34, without reading them in the context of verse 35, which is why I wrote it here. Okay? Once you attain that highest knowledge, yaj jnatva, now we're looking at verse 35, na punar moham eva yasasi, you will never again fall into a state of delusion, moha. And then the second line, which is all important, yena bhutani asheshena drakshasi atmani atomai. Here, Krishna explains what exactly is the content of this highest spiritual knowledge. What is that content? You shall see all existences, all bhutani, in the self, atmani, capital S self, non-dual self. Then in me, atomai, then in me. Krishna is distinguishing the highest non-dual self from himself. And there's a sequence here. You will first realize these existences in the non-dual self, then you will realize them in me. So what is the me? What do you think the me is, as opposed to the self?
Brahman.
Purushottama, exactly. So the self here is somebody, I think it was you, and not to single you out, but in your study question response, Keshav, you seem to take the self to mean lowercase s, Jivatman, individual self, but I don't think that's right actually. But one thing that's confusing is that he uses lowercase s, which can lead you to think that he's not talking about the higher self. But I think that's just that's a little misleading. When he says self-knowledge, even if it's lowercase s, he means the highest knowledge of non-dual self, the non-dual Atman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Okay? Because the context, I think, justifies that. We'll look at that when we look at the handout. Okay? But I'm giving, as I said, a high altitude explanation of these verses first. Okay, so notice 35, last phrase, Atmani atomai. You will first recognize all existences, realize all existences in the non-dual self. That corresponds to Sri Ramakrishna's jnana. And as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Gyanat body Vigyan. After Jnana comes Vijnana. Exactly like that, Ataha. The word Ataha in Sanskrit means then. After that. after realizing the non-dual self and all existences in the non-dual self, you realize me, all existences in me, which is, as Keshav says, the impersonal, personal, divine Purushottama. Yeah.
But here, Krishna seems to imply that the two are paired, like Vijnana follows inevitably after Jnana, whereas Sri Ramakrishna says it's not necessary that everyone attains to Vijnana.
Yeah, very good. That's a very good question. I get this question a lot because I talk about Vijnana Vedanta a lot, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana. And if you read the Gospel, what you often find is him saying things like, he distinguishes between two categories of jiva, jiva koti and ishvara koti. And he says that typically ordinary jivas, jiva kotis, are only capable of attaining jnana, and they can't really attain the state of vijnana. And usually it's only ishvara kotis, special divinely commissioned souls. How does he define ishvara koti? Anyone? He gives a very precise definition in one place in the Gospel.
Parts of Lila.
Almost. Avatar ba avatar and Angsha in Bangla, which means incarnations of God and those who are born as Amshas, portions of the incarnation. That's his precise definition of Ishvara Koti. So those are very high level people. There's not even ordinary realized souls. So it might seem as if Vijnana is a very rarefied state, and Sri Ramakrishna does often seem to speak of it as a very rarefied state. However, there are places in the Gospel where he hints that even ordinary people can be elevated to the status of an Ishvara Koti and become a Vijnani. That's one thing. One clue is that Mahapurush Maharaj, Shivanandaji, one of our great direct monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, he says in a letter, Sri Ramakrishna didn't give me the stamp of an Ishvara Koti, because he only gave that stamp to 6 people or 8 people, right? Brahmananda, Swamiji, and some others. But by his grace, I have been elevated to the status of an Ishvara Koti. So that's already opening the door to, it's not quite as rigid a categorization of Ishvara Koti and Jiva Koti. One can go between by God's grace. But secondly, I see Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo as basically saying, in their own interpretation of Vedanta, that with the advent of the Ramakrishna incarnation, Sri Ramakrishna has opened the floodgates of Vijnana to all. He has universalized, he has made universally accessible this state, this rarefied state of Vijnana, which hitherto was only open to a tiny minority of great souls. I really see this. If you look at Swamiji, the way that he expounds Vedanta in his lectures, God and everything, he's always talking about the highest realization as Vijnana. And he never says that this is only open to a small minority of people. And Sri Ramakrishna himself, as the avatar, is not saying that I've opened this, right? But it took his disciples and his followers to say that, basically. With the advent of Ramakrishna coming here on earth as God himself, and showing to us in his life, the Vijnani's life, now he has made the state of Vijnana accessible to everybody. And so Sri Aurobindo then will interpret the Gita in that more universal light as well. And saying that actually the scriptures talk about Vijnana as the highest state of knowledge, and which everybody can access. Okay? That's kind of long answer to the question. It's a good question. Okay. So, contextual justification means what? You explain a particular verse in the light of surrounding verses.
Right.
But then, there are kind of concentric circles, a kind of thing going on here, right? So the smallest circle is just verse 4.33, or 4.33 to 30. So now, he's saying that we should first, the smallest concentric circle is, you should read these 3 verses together, 33, 34, and 35. They make the most sense if you take them together. So you can't understand what jnana means in 33 and 34 unless you read them in the light of this statement of 35, Drakshasi Atmani Atomai. But the circles grow bigger. They widen. Because then and this is what I'm hoping my handout shows. Because what I've included is, after the section on 4.34 to 35, I have his commentaries in translation of verses 7.2 to 7.3, where the terms jnana and vijnana are used, because he sees a consistency also in the terms, how the term jnana and vijnana is explained. And we'll get to that in the next class. And all the way up to, and this is just an example, but he reads the entire Gita, all 700 verses, as consistent with this interpretation. So the circles grow wider, so including chapter 7, including chapter 18. You see what I mean? So the contextual justification is, it gets broader and broader. And I want to give you a taste of that. by giving you some of the verses so verses 2 and 3 from chapter 7 and verses 54 to 56 of chapter 18. Okay? And that's what we're going to be discussing today and for the next week. So I suggested what we do with the remaining about 10 minutes is that we start looking at the handout. Because to understand this deeply, we need to have a really good understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Jnana and Vijnana. And for those of you who lean Shankarite, I want to persuade you briefly. Of course, the more rigorous case is made in my academic works, my books. But in lieu of that, or if you're lazy, I have this handout. I'm not looking at anyone in particular. Okay. So let's look at this. December 16th, 1883. This is from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita. M asks a point-blank question, because he, like us, is confused. Are you a Shankarite, Sri Ramakrishna? Is the world unreal? Master, why should it be unreal? That is how Advaita Jnanis reason. Osha bicharit kotha. And for those of you who don't know Bangla, for those unfortunate souls who don't know Bangla, Rahul is one of the fortunate souls. One of the problems is the English translation, Nicolanji's translation, the way he renders that sentence, this is my translation, that is how Advaita Jnanis reason. Because the original Bangla is Osha bicharit kotha, and Nicolanji says that is a matter for philosophical discussion. I think that's completely wrong. Osha bicharit kotha, vichara, that is the way that Jnanis reason. And he literally goes on to then explain what is, if you might say, well, how do you know that that's the kind of reasoning going on? The next sentence, let's look at it. In the beginning, when a person reasons, that same vichara, following the Advaita Vedantic method of not this, neti neti, he realizes that Brahman is not the living beings, not the universe, not the 24 cosmic principles. Jagat mithya, Brahma satyam jagat mithya, the famous formula of Shankaracharya. Non-dual pure consciousness alone is real, everything else an illusion. All these things become like dreams to him. Can Sri Ramakrishna be any more explicit? He's now talking about the stage of jnana. Through this neti vichara, we'll get to the metaphor in a second in the next paragraph. But okay, let's keep reading. All these things become like dreams to him. Jagat mithya. Then, atomai. Then what? Atomai meaning that, you see what I'm making connections here already. First you realize the self, then you realize all existence is in me. Then he says, then evolution follows involution. Anulom vilom. Anuloma viloma. And he feels that God herself has become the universe and all living beings. Very interesting. First, when you attain the state of jnana, and even in the spiritual practice of Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, this world is not real, my body is not real, my mind is not real, these chairs are not real, these people are not real, it's a dream. Until you realize what? You realize Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, that's not the end of spiritual life. You can go further. Once you attain jnana, he says what? He uses the example of, he says, suppose you are climbing to the roof by the stairs. You want to get to the roof. Use the staircase. As long as you are aware of the roof, you are also aware of the stairs. He who is aware of the high is also aware of the low. But after reaching the roof, which is jnana, you realize that the stairs are made of the same materials, brick, lime, and brick dust, as the roof. That's the vijnana. After reaching the roof, which is jnana, what do you realize? Wait a minute. That very staircase I climbed, which I was rejecting, saying it's not this, not this. Now I realize Brahman has become all that. It's the same materials as the roof. What does that mean? It means that this world is not an illusion, it's not a dream, it's a real manifestation of the divine. And he also adds that the Vijnani realizes, as I said before, Jini Nirgun Tini Shogun, that reality which I realized in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi as non-dual, impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness is also Shakti, Saguna Brahman. It's because Shakti is real, and he would often teach Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like fire and its power to burn. Shakti is 100% real, otherwise why in the world would we be worshipping Kali? And yet people who interpret Sri Ramakrishna through the lens of Shankara have to say that ultimately Shakti itself is unreal. It becomes extremely implausible, in my opinion. And that Shakti, Divine Mother, becomes the 24 cosmic principle, which means becomes everything without exception. in this world. Okay? So I hope you're beginning to see connections with the Gita as well. But let's read a few more of his teachings on Vijnana, which help us to understand the term Vijnana in the Gita and Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the different verses. April 5th, 1884. He says, but Vijnana means knowledge with a greater fullness. With a greater fullness. Vishesh Rupe Jana. V. Jnana is knowledge. What does the V add? In Sanskrit, the prefix V acts as an intensifier. So knowledge, Vijnana means deeper knowledge, more intimate knowledge, more comprehensive knowledge, more expansive knowledge, fuller knowledge. This is exactly how Sri Ramakrishna explains it. And this is how Sri Aurobindo will interpret the difference between Jnana and Vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita as well. Okay? Then he continues. Some have heard of milk, some have seen milk, and some have drunk milk. He who has merely heard of it is ignorant. He who has seen it is a jnani. But he who has drunk it has vijnana, that is to say, a fuller knowledge of it. After having the vision of God, one talks to him as if he were an intimate relative. That is vijnana. A deeper, more comprehensive, integral knowledge is one of Sri Aurobindo's favorite terms, and he'll often gloss the term vijnana in the Gita as an integral knowledge. In Aurobindo's, yeah, go ahead.
So, when I think about this, I remember what Kabir Das said.
What says? Kabir
Das said.
Kabir.
When I went to find God, I found myself. And when I went to find myself, I found God. Something along those lines, right? So now jnana is probably the state where, we're saying, okay, I'm trying to find myself, and I found myself.
Correct.
But is vijnana then actually trying to find God after finding myself? Is that what that is?
Yeah, except that there's no distinction between God and the self. God, as Purushottama, is impersonal, personal, and so the static aspect of God, of that Purushottama, is the non-dual self.
Because in Advaita, a jnani doesn't, even the concept of incarnation isn't real in
Yeah.
Advaita.
Well, it's part of the Vyavaharika Satta, the empirical, it's only empirically real.
Right.
Yeah, but again, as I said, this is a totally different framework. Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, in my opinion, and you can look at the book if you want to kind of decide for yourself, and the whole Gita. Look at chapter 4. We haven't looked at the verses yet, but they're famous verses, yada yada hidanmasya, about the incarnation. There's no suggestion that it's a lower reality. That's from the standpoint of ignorance that we believe in avatars. And there's absolutely no evidence, in my opinion, that Jagat is mithya in the Gita. I don't see that anywhere.
Right,
I don't
so
see.
is that a progression then, in the personal journey, where you say, come to jnana, know that all sarva bhutani in me,
Yeah.
and then
No, not in me. In the self first, and then in
the
me.
self,
Yeah, exactly.
And then
Yes.
the self itself is Purushottama.
Yeah, well, you realize that the self is an aspect of the
As a
even
second stage.
more expansive. Yeah, that's why the ataha, the term ataha in Sanskrit, where's the... It means then, and then, after that. So he's really pushing that and saying, and exactly like Sri Ramakrishna says, after jnana comes vijnana. Krishna is saying in verse 4.35, after realizing the non-dual self, you then realize me, and the self as an aspect of me. And that becomes absolutely explicit and codified in the doctrine of the triple Purusha. The three Purushas, which we'll eventually get to in chapter 15 of the Gita. And as we've already seen, he's bringing in that doctrine constantly to explain concepts in the earlier chapters. What are the three Purushas? Kshara Purusha, Akshara Purusha, and Purushottama. Akshara Purusha is what corresponds to, so maybe I should add that. I keep losing my marker. Akshara Purusha is this non-dual self. And this is obviously the Purushottama, the third Purusha. And what Sri Aurobindo says is, the Gita holds that it is the divine Purushottama that manifests as both, in one aspect, the Akshara Purusha, and as Kshara Purusha. It's just the same word without the A, which means this entire Leela, this whole world, this mutable becoming is the way he puts it, is also God. Exactly like Sri Ramakrishna says, the Vijnana sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. So the Kshara Purusha is the Leela manifestation, the manifestation of the Purushottama in the form of this cosmic Leela. Akshara Purusha is the non-dual, impersonal aspect of the same Purushottama. And the Purushottama itself is a whole kit and caboodle. It's the whole thing. Sri Ramakrishna has a beautiful teaching, one of my favorites. He says there's a washerman, and he has got a tub of dye, and there's a whole line of people with t-shirts, white t-shirts, Hanes or whatever. Okay, so he brings this white t-shirt to this washerman, and the washerman asks, what color do you want your t-shirt to be dyed in? And one person, I want it green. And then, bloop, comes out green. Next guy comes, hands him the same, like another white Hanes t-shirt. And the washerman says, what color do you want it? He says, red. Same tub of dye. It's not that he's got millions of tubs of dye. Same tub of dye, dips it, comes out red. Now, people in the line are like, what the heck is going on here? So one guy comes, and so one after another though, people aren't phased and they're asking for one particular color. I wanted green, I wanted blue, I wanted orange. One guy's like, he asked the same question by the washerman. What color do you want your t-shirt dyed in? I want my t-shirt to be dyed in the color of your magical tub dye. What's the difference between his request and the request of everyone else? Tell me.
He wants the whole thing.
He wants the whole kit and caboodle. He says, I want to think of God and realize God as Purushottama. I'm not satisfied with anything less. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, I am a glutton in the spiritual field. He realized God as Kali, and then was not satisfied. He said, now, O mother, reveal yourself to me as Krishna, Sita, Ganesha, Christ, Allah, this and that. Non-dual pure consciousness. He couldn't rest until he realized the whole thing. He's that washerman. He's the Vijnani. I'm not the washerman and also that person who wants the t-shirt in the universal tub dye color, right? So that's what the Gita is saying. Have a maximally expansive conception of the divine. What happens? Your spiritual life becomes richer because then no conflict between jnana and bhakti anymore. Jnana yoga and bhakti yoga. The perennial conflict. No such thing. You don't say bhakti is lower than jnana. No, because when you want to meditate on the non-dual self, do it to your heart's content. Knowing that it's the non-dual impersonal aspect of the divine Purushottama. But you can also practice bhakti at the same time by focusing on the dynamic personal aspect, the Shakti aspect of the same Purushottama. No conflict, right? And secondly, it's a great antidote to fanaticism. Because the narrower your conception of God, the more you're going to limit God to just how you like to think of God. The blind man touching just the tail of the elephant and saying that the elephant is nothing but the tail. Whereas if we have a very broad understanding of the divine, we can embrace the whole world. And we won't have a conflict with anybody. Okay, we're going to continue this next week. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. That was rude of me. I should have asked for questions. I mean, we have 2 minutes maybe for a question. Okay, Keshav's got a question.
Why did you, above you translated from the Bangla God herself, and then below for April 5th you said God, one talks to him.
Okay,
I
sorry.
was wondering if in the Bangla there's...
This handout is poorly edited. Nice catch. Because I'm copying and pasting from Nicolanji's translation and then modifying it. And one of the things I strongly disagree with in Nicolanji's translation is that he consistently renders God as he. And I think that's wrong in most contexts in the gospel. It should be she. And so that's my mistake. It should be here as if she were an intimate relative. One talks to her as if she were an intimate relative. And that's, so please correct that on the handout. Okay? Because, why? Sri Ramakrishna would love to think of God as Divine Mother. So unless he's specifically talking about a male-gendered God like Shiva or Krishna, the default needs to be that he's thinking of God as she, in my opinion. Okay? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Next week, double header.